everybody, welcome back to class. This week we're going to shift gears a little bit. We're going to define leadership, and then we're also going to talk about leadership development. Now it's important that you know that these are two separate things. Conceiving of leadership, right, what it is, defining it, kind of talking about this process approach that we've been talking about in the class, and then also talking about leadership development. That is, how does one develop as a leader, right? So we talked about leadership as a process. But what is that process? Is it happenstance? Is it circumstance? Is it, divine intervention? What are some of the things that have to happen in order for one to develop as a leader? So it's important to think about leadership and what it is as a distinct concept from leadership development and how it happens. All right? So hang on to your hat as we take a whirlwind tour through the definitions of leadership and leadership development. Now, before we get into the specifics and kind of get all academic, I want to share a quick story with you. Now you'll see here a picture of a cool looking ancient dude. Some of you might recognize this. This is St. Francis of Assisi. Now why do I start off a topic of leadership by showing you pictures of an old guy? Well, in my opinion, St. Francis really epitomizes leadership in so many ways. Some of you might know his story. Maybe you've even seen the classic 70s Zeffirelli movie, Brother, Sun, Sister Moon. Great movie. Anyhow, St. Francis lived in a time during the Crusades, kind of the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, if you will. And he had all the benefits of being the son of a rich merchant. And his father offered to give him everything. And Francis avoided all that. And he tried to make his own way. He went off to the Crusades, but he really didn't like, spilling blood. He really didn't appreciate people, trying to spill his blood. And he also tried the things that a lot of young men do, of course, partying and girls, and going out to clubs and raving and all that kind of stuff. Well, at least the Dark Ages equivalent of raving, right? But of course, like most of us, he found that empty and not very satisfying. And so as he was contemplating his life and what was important, he went out into the woods and he stumbled upon this broken down chapel. And as he was looking at this chapel, he really believed that the Lord spoke to him and said, "Francis, build my church." And so he thought to himself, okay, I can rebuild this old broken down chapel over here. And so he started to grab the bricks, one by one and stack them back up. And as he was doing this, he really got a sense that that's not what God was calling him to. God was calling him to rebuild the church, right? Capital T church. In other words, to live a life of simplicity, to preach the gospel, to be compassionate, and to share the love of Christ with others. And so as he began to build this project, other people were attracted to Francis. He was such a humble and simple man, and they said, "Hey, can we join you?" And he said, "Sure, man, start grabbing some bricks. God's called me to rebuild his church." And he began to disciple these men, and they began to live this life of simplicity and purity and chastity and holiness. And in time, you might know, Francis developed what became one of the largest orders in the church at that time, and they're now known as the Franciscans, right? They still exist. And so this organization that Francis developed really didn't come because somebody appointed Francis. It's like, "Hey, Francis, we want you to start this organization and you're going to be about this and that." No, it came out of his own passion, his own sense of calling from the Lord to do something important. And by following that passion, by listening to the Lord, by doing what he felt was important, he attracted other people. And the other people said, "Yeah, we want to do that." Well, isn't that what the essence of leadership is following our sense of passion and commitment and calling to the Lord and letting other people see that and say, "Yeah, I want to do that too." So we preface this talk on leadership by saying it really comes out of our own sense of passion and calling by following that vision that the Lord has given us and letting other people see that. Now, that's where it begins. That's not where it ends. But I want to preface it by saying that really is a foundational idea in being an effective leader. Okay, now that I've shared the fun story about Francis, let's talk about some definitions of leadership. We can look at it in a couple of different ways. One would be a person-centered approach. Now, Peter Northouse defines leadership as a process whereby an individual influences a group of individuals to achieve a common goal. Now, once upon a time, leadership was sort of looked at as this coercive, I'm going to get you to do things that I think are important, right? But as it's evolved, as our thinking about leadership has matured, we really see that it is really more of this kind of common goal, right? What are the things that are important to me that are important to us as a group? And you see Francis had that. His passion, his vision drove his goals, and other people said, yes, we have those same goals. We want to follow you in carrying out that goal. Now, another idea here is what I call an outcome-centered approach. And this could be looked at as the following. Leadership occurs when there is direction, alignment, and commitment. Okay, now there's three things there, right? DAC, direction, alignment, and commitment. Now, why you say, well, this is so weird, this is wonky, I don't understand this. Because sometimes we think about leadership as residing in a person, right? So my story of Francis is leadership in a person. But when we sort of take leadership out of a person, we can then place it into other sorts of things, right? Like in a group, right? So you've heard of things like shared leadership or team leadership. Also, there's something called leadership substitution, where leadership happens. It doesn't necessarily happen in a person. It is inherent in the task or in the organization that develops a culture that develops leaders, right? So when there is direction, alignment, and commitment, right, then leadership happens regardless if it is in a person, in a group, in a sort of self-guiding task or process, right? Okay, so I know it's a little abstract, but you have to sort of think a little bit more complex about leadership, that it's not just about a person, right? Oh, there's the person, that's the person we need to follow. He or she is going to provide leadership. That often happens, but leadership doesn't necessarily reside in a person. It is sort of a byproduct of when these things happen. So there's direction, i.e. we know where we're going, we know what the goals are, we know what the mission is. When there's alignment, when all of the resources, the budget, the structure, the mission, the vision are all aligned with the strategy, right, to accomplish the goals. And then commitment. So when people are motivated, when people are in tune with the mission, when they're committed, they say, yes, this is what we want to do, okay? So those three things then actually provide leadership, whether they come from a person, whether they come from a group of people who agree on something, like in a shared leadership model, or whether they are sort of embedded in a culture, right? Okay, so important to understand the distinction between those person-centered approach and then the outcomes of leadership themselves. Now, this next chart shows you that leadership is an interaction between three things: the leader, the follower, and the situation. And as these three things vary, so too will leadership vary. All right, now, why is this important? Because we can't just talk about a leader in isolation, a leader in a vacuum, a leader, all by himself, because leadership does not happen until he or she begins to interact with these other variables, all right? So we've got three main variables here in the leadership process. So the person of the leader, and then the followers. And we talked about this, last week. There's no followers, there's really no leadership, right? There's an old saying, if you want to find out if you're a leader, turn around and see if there's anybody following you, right? If there's nobody following you, then you're just taking a walk. You're fooling yourself, you're not really a leader. Okay, so there's the leader and the follower, and as those two change, so does the leadership interaction, right? So this is important because we think about things like the followers, their maturity, right, where they are, right? So if you have a sort of a new follower, maybe a new believer, a new disciple, somebody you're trying to help, your leadership is going to look a little bit different. If the follower is a little more mature, right, then your leadership's going to look a little more different. You're going to be a little more hands-off. You're going to delegate a little more. You're going to empower more, right? So the leadership looks differently depending upon the relationship of those two, right? How good your relationship is, right? Are you real close? A little distance. You need to bring that distance together, right? And then, of course, there's the situation. And not all situations are the same. You might come into a leadership situation. Let's just say you're taking over a church that's kind of struggling. Maybe it's kind of a turnaround situation. Well, your leadership is going to look a little different in that context than if you came into more of a mature, well-established, thriving kind of a church, right? So the situation is going to dictate how you practice leadership. And then, of course, there's the interaction between the follower and the situation, right? So maybe they're feeling a little freaked out about this, struggling church or the downturn, right? So now your leadership involves, giving them the pep talk and the heave-ho and the not the heave-ho. You don't want to give them the heave-ho. That means sending them out the door. We don't want to do that. Giving them the encouragement, right? And the assurance that things are going to be all right, that there's a vision, that the Lord's given you a vision, and that together you guys can address this situation. All right. So it's important to think about the totality of what's going on in leadership and not just think about leadership, the person of the leader. Now, we can also say that leadership happens at different levels. Let's take a look at some of these different levels here. First of all, there's leading oneself. Spiritual, mental, and emotional growth, self-awareness, growth in task knowledge. A guy named Charles Manns came up with an interesting concept called self-leadership, right? And what does this mean? This means that, we're not always motivated by something outside, but we ourselves as leaders are able to motivate ourselves. And that might be based on a lot of things, right? Our calling, our passion, our goals, our vision, the task at hand. The task might be inherently motivating. So leading ourselves, developing ourselves, our spiritual growth, our mental growth, our emotional growth, right? It's no secret. Leaders also, are human beings and they have emotional problems and issues. Sometimes they need to get counseling. They need to get over things. They need to deal with struggles and whatnot. Self-awareness. This is a big one. I always say this to my classes, and I'm going to say it to you. Self-awareness is the beginning of leadership growth, okay? Self-awareness is the beginning of leadership growth. Now, why is this important? Because if you are not self-aware, in other words, if you don't know how other people see you, right, you have what are called blind spots. Now, you don't want to have blind spots because other people can see those things, but you can't see them. So, self-awareness is important because it helps us to know what our strengths are, what our weaknesses are, what we're good at, what we're not good at, how other people perceive us. It's so important to become self-aware. And as you grow as a leader, as you think about your own growth as a leader, you want to embrace self-awareness. You want to seek self-awareness. You don't want to run from the truth, right? Because again, if you've got a certain personality and other people see it and perceive you a certain way, but you don't see it, no, I'm this. Well, everybody sees that you're this. That's not a good thing, all right? So this is what's called being authentic and transparent, right? Of owning up to yourself, of owning up to your story. And, some of us have hard stories. Some of us have painful stories. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. Yeah, it was bad when we were going through it. But I believe, as the scripture says, all things work together for good, right? So God has allowed us to go through trials and circumstances so that at the end we are refined and matured on all these sort of things, right? So it's okay to acknowledge the pain, acknowledge the challenge and all those sort of things, because now what? God has a refined, sharpened, self-aware, self-reflective, humble, transparent kind of leader that he can really use. Now, the next level of leadership is leading other individuals, right? So this is sort of that dyad level, right? There's you and there's the other person, right? So a lot of leadership has to do with sort of this one-on-one interpersonal relationship kind of thing. This is very important, because as a leader, people are impacted and they're influenced by you as a person. So when you have a discussion with them, right? When you sit down and you have a conversation, when you have a phone call, email, that is all sort of interpersonal communication that's going to influence them, that you have the opportunity to, to help them connect with the mission and the goals of the organization and for you to lead them in that level. Now, the next level is leading groups and teams. Now, of course, we all know that groups and teams are pervasive in organization, especially in churches. You've got all kinds of different groups and subgroups. And so we have to understand sort of some of those group dynamics. And we talk about that in a different class, but you need to be aware that not sometimes, but oftentimes your leadership is going to happen with multiple people. It's going to be in a team setting or a group setting. The next level is leading an organization, like a business, like a church. whatever it is, this becomes a little more complex now. When you think about what is a church or an organization, it really is sort of a combination of a bunch of different groups, right? So maybe you have the men's ministry and the women's ministry and the children and the youth and the outreach, and so you get all these different groups, and it becomes a little more complex now. So your thinking needs to be a little more complex. You're not just thinking about one person or a group of people. You're thinking about how all these people work together in order to accomplish the vision and the mission of the organization. And then, of course, the highest level is linking with other organizations and affiliations, right? So you know that your church, your organization doesn't exist all by itself. There's other people, other groups, maybe in your denomination, in your neighborhood, in the world, right? So leaders need to acknowledge that they're leading an organization that has relationships with other organizations, and it might even be things like the government or the city. It might even be like people that oppose you, right? So leadership also has to think about sort of how our organization, church, nonprofit, kind of is aligned with or juxtaposed to others in our environment. And when I talk about environment, I'm not talking about air and water. I'm talking about all those things outside of the organization proper.